Welcome boys and girls, Costin here with a discussion about 5 key issues that Creative Assembly should be looking to address going forward in Total War Warhammer 3 Immortal Empires. These are fundamental game problems to a degree or another that I do think they should focus on resolving. But let me know what you guys think. What kind of issue do you believe that they should focus on, and how much importance they should give for one particular issue versus another. The first thing I want to talk about is the issue of auto-resolve. So, to understand the problems of an auto-resolve system is that it is based on damage. And the problem with the way it works is that units that have a high degree of armor will take significantly less damage than units with lower degrees of armor. This does not necessarily apply in an actual battle situation. So you might auto-resolve a battle like this with Arbol. This is a really good army, and you might take very few casualties. But this is one of the first battles in a campaign. But if you're playing another race, a race like Skaven, Greenskins, Slaanesh, so on and so forth, that have units with low level of armor, they will actually take more damage. It doesn't matter if in the actual manual battle you would take very little damage, if any at all. Like, I've won battles, many battles, especially early on in the campaign, with very weak armies in terms of like auto-resolve result, and you win them with like 10 soldiers lost. There is a gap in between them. There's several issues that come from this. One, it actually, beyond the fact that it's an incorrect result, and doesn't just apply to you as a player, it also applies to the AI and the kind of things that end up happening on a campaign map. But beyond that, it's also the fact that it's pushing you as a player to learn the wrong things in terms of playing battles. Because you get to a point when you're playing a campaign, you get to a point where it becomes less about playing battles properly and more about abusing various mechanics in order to minimize your casualties, because that is very, very important. So my perspective on how the auto-resolve system should work, it should reflect the actual power of an army. Like, an army led by a lord should have more power than an army that doesn't have a lord or lower level lord. Armor should not factor in, because it can factor in battles, of course, but there's many other things. There's armor piercing, there's flanking, there's a ranged army versus a melee army. Those kind of factors do play a role, and they're not properly addressed. There's too much importance to armor, less importance to things like unit ranks, unit tiers, and so on and so forth. Some people have suggested that what the auto-resolve should be based on is the actual cost of units. There's actually a lot of balancing that Creative Assembly puts in terms of unit costs for the sake of multiplayer, and if they could use that instead for the sake of auto-resolve, that would be great. Another issue with respect to the auto-resolve is how the auto-resolve difficulty, or the AI benefits from a higher battle difficulty in a campaign. So if you set the battle difficulty higher than normal, then the AI will get an inherent bonus to auto-resolve against you. The problem is, well, it obviously is not really the way battles do play out. I think there should at least be a different meter. And finally, the third issue with regards to auto-resolve, beyond the damage certain units take, favoring certain armies versus others, and creating certain campaign situations where you just steamroll over everything, as opposed to campaigns where you have to fight every single battle manually. Like, look at this army. I could go against this army with like Skaven slaves, right? Maybe I would take more damage than obviously Chaos Warriors because of the Ogre Bull charge, sure, but I could use a Lord to tank a lot of that damage. I could kite. I have options as a player, and that's how you should kind of play these battles. But again, the game is not teaching you to play battles correctly, so when you actually do end up with a serious challenge, and this has happened to me with all the thousands of hours I have, you end up not being prepared. But the final issue is that every settlement in game on every difficulty has an inherent auto-resolve benefit. See, the problem with auto-resolve is not even necessarily the field battles. That can be fine. Like, you can have situations where you meet an army on the field of battle, and in terms of like two armies clashing with each other, that's better. But with every settlement, it has an inherent auto-resolve benefit, and that is ridiculous. If anything, settlements should have an auto-resolve downside, especially if they have walls. That does relate to another issue, and that is of sieges. And that's just the way the game is designed. Now, how do you address this at the moment if you're looking to play Warhammer 3? Well, there's mods that give you an auto-resolve benefit. There's mods that remove the benefit that settlements have, and this affects both you and AI. So there's ways, but it's not really a perfect option because you still have a system that ultimately rewards people for building the wrong army compositions just because they have higher level armor, as opposed to having a better unit variety. Like if you're playing a Khorne campaign, for instance, or if you're playing any Chaos campaign out of Champions or the Mono Gods, you're really rewarded for getting an entire army of Chaos Warriors. But is that really the best army you could make? Not quite. But it is the best army you can make in terms of auto-resolve, and does cut down on the grind. That is not a great situation in a campaign. So I think that is absolutely something that Creative Assembly should prioritize going forward. All manner of things like the AI cheating, the settlement cheating, the difficulty modifier on the subject, it's all a bit ridiculous. At least those things. Armor situation, bit different to be sure, would be more complicated to resolve that problem. Now, the second issue to talk about over here is with regards to Confederation, and just in general, things like vassals and military allies and the way you interact with them could be better. And heck, in general, diplomacy, aversion, those kind of things could be improved. But at the top of the list of various diplomatic improvements should be Confederation, because I feel Confederation should, the way it should work from my point of view, is that you should be looking to build a relationship with a faction and then being able to confederate them. But if you are actually a good ally to a faction, if you help them keep territory, if you help them maintain their strength, if you help them stay alive, you're actually not really benefiting yourself that much. Sometimes it can work out, but the best way to handle a confederation is to end up abusing various systems. Like, for instance, you know, I'll just sell my initial settlement over here to the Dracaena Enclave, then I'll sell another settlement or two other settlements on turn 2. I'll get Confederation on turn 2. Very simple, very fast, very easy. But that is not a great system, because it pushes you as a player towards abusing diplomacy as opposed to using it as a good tool. It doesn't feel natural, it feels forced, it feels cheesy, it feels like exploiting the game, and yet if you try and play it naturally, it ends up being pretty bad. Now, my perspective on this is, while systems like, say, the Dwarf system or Chaos Dwarf system can work very well in terms of guaranteeing a confederation, or Karl Franz, or Ogres, or Greenskins, they do have systems that work, that guarantee confederation, but even those systems are not necessarily the best in the world. I mean, it makes sense for Greenskins to just beat each other up and end up with a confederation as a result of it. But I also feel you should have a system with the Greenskins where you become really powerful. Maybe you do a couple of WAs, or maybe the WA mechanic should be changed, and you have a meter that fills up, and the more you fill up, the more factions are willing to confederate with you. Or with the Order-Tide factions, you could have a situation where you start working together with a faction, and maybe you should have a separate confederation option. Like, separate in the sense that it would require you to actually build a relationship with a faction, and it would start filling up a meter by doing various things to that faction, like helping them in wars, maybe trading them territory, all that kind of stuff. And then you could have that guaranteed confederation. That is how I would view it, but I'm sure there's other ways of tackling it. But right now, it just kind of feels like playing Russian roulette, unless you end up abusing it, unless you cheat, essentially, in order to achieve success. Like, for instance, selling territories with barracks in them to various AI factions, selling territory to them that's vulnerable, literally declaring war and dragging your allies into wars against factions that you don't actually want to fight, or you would ever fight, but just doing that so that they're more vulnerable and they're willing to confederate. There's a lot of bullshit involved in the system right now, and I think Confederation is one of those systems that Creative Assembly has not handled well for a very, very long time, or ever, and I do believe that they should look to improve how this system works. It's better in some cases than others, to be sure, but for the vast majority of actions, it's not great. You can use mods. You can guarantee confederation from mods. You can use console commands and all that kind of stuff. But again, it's just abusing certain things, exploiting certain things, or outright cheating in order to get the result that you want. And that is a problem, as I see it. The worst example of confederation is actually to do with High Elves. Like, you might think the best way to handle a High Elven campaign is to, let's play together, conquer Ulthuan, maybe, Tyrion gets a bit of territory, Alarielle a bit of territory, Alfarian a bit of territory. That will just end up screwing you over in a campaign in so many different ways, because you will literally end up in a situation where it's not impossible to confederate, but it will be extremely difficult to pull off that kind of confederation. So, like, just confederation in general should be overhauled as a baseline. Whatever kind of unique racial mechanics certain races can have, that's a different discussion, but the baseline system of confederation should be improved from my point of view. The third issue to tackle would be with respect to management of an empire, or rather, as you might say, automation. Because when you're playing the campaign, and once you get used to how to play a campaign, you realize that doing things in the exact same way in every single provinces, or a lot of the same decisions in every single province, with every single hero, with every single lord that you own, unless they're a legendary lord, unless they have a special skill line. But for the most part, you're always going to want to make the same decisions. Like, for instance, let's take a Kislev Patriarch as an example. If I'm using a Kislev Patriarch, 99% of the time, what I'll want to do every single time is I'll want to improve replenishment, I'll want to get Icon of Strength, I'll want to get Ursen's Roar, get Impassioned, Wild-Eyed, survivability, and then ultimately this. And whatever blessing or whatever shout in battle that I want for that particular Patriarch. But essentially, the only variety over here in terms of leveling a hero up here is with regards to this choice of a skill line here, and then the special skill line choice that we have at the top. That is it. Everything else, every other skill choice, you would pick the exact same every single time. This applies to lords, this applies to heroes, hell, this even applies to legendary lords. But we have no way of automating that. With items, you almost always in a campaign, or a lot of the times, especially as you're building a massive empire, you do want to end up getting blue quality items, especially because you may want to get your hands, on Armors of Destiny, blue quality weapons, blue quality arcane items, enchanted items. But that means you have to go and just do a bunch of item fusing, and it's just this tedious micromanagement of various things. And same with how province development is handled. Unless you're going for a specific hero capacity, and even if you are, you're usually going to want some combination of economic buildings, growth buildings, and if you need it, controlled buildings. But a lot of the time, you're going to make the same choices over and over again. This is not really an issue early on in a campaign. It becomes an issue once you do start controlling a good amount of territory, and it is something that ends up impacting the late game fun that you do have while playing a campaign in Warhammer 3. There is a way to automate things a bit, I get it, but it's just not really a great, there's just never really been a great system. I think what we need is a system where we could select, okay, I want to build these kind of structures in a province, right? Like, you can enable auto-construct buildings, right? And you can focus on, economy, military, and all that, but you don't control the kind of buildings you want in a specific province. And even then, you're still going to micromanage shit, because you're going to go into a province, right? You're going to have to verify that AI is actually using its resources correctly over here. I don't think anyone really uses auto-construction for different things. So I think, like, we do need a better system of this where we can control what we're actually going to get from provinces, the kind of priority we can assign to buildings, or like, okay, I'm taking over this province, I want these buildings constructed, and I then want them automatically upgraded if I have X amount of money. Just an idea over there. Or with items, for instance, item management. Like, there are mods that help with that, to be sure, but there should be a way like, okay, I want every green item merged, I want, and to get all the blue, like every gray and green item merged, and to get as many blue items as I can. Just a notion, right? Just a notion. And maybe a better way of assigning items and ancillaries and all that kind of stuff in a campaign. Just a better UI with respect to that. So that's something I would hope Creative Assembly does improve on in Warhammer 3, because it is very, very tedious to tackle. Next up, we have the issue of the endgame. There is practically no endgame worth talking about in Warhammer 3. There is an endgame crisis potential, an ultimate endgame crisis potential, but that just is a grind. You have a certain period, or the possibility of a period of time in which an endgame crisis or an ultimate endgame crisis can spawn, and then you have a vast amount of enemies spawning all at once. That is not a great system. One, it can be predictable. Or even if it's random, even if you don't know when it's coming, and you set the warning timer to 0, you get and you enable all of them, and you might get a random one. Okay, that could be a bit interesting, but it's the way it works. With respect to an endgame, I think with something like an endgame crisis, it would be good to have like kind of a progressive challenge, in the sense that the AI just, you do have certain factions selected. Like, you have faction potential, but it's not good enough. The way the AI cheats and AI faction potential works, it's the same from the beginning until the end of a campaign. So you don't have that sense of like a progressive difficulty in Warhammer 3, you have an inverted difficulty. You have a campaign that starts difficult, regardless of which campaign you're talking about, even the easiest ones. But even the easiest campaigns will be the most difficult early on. But then as you play for them, if you know what you're doing, if you understand the game, it just gets easier and easier. And even if you don't understand the game, even if you're a completely new player, and I've experienced this all the way back since Warhammer 1, even if you're a new player, the early game is far more brutal than the late game. Like, you're still grappling with the various game systems, handling things, handling armies, handling empire management. That's one of the reasons why the early game is more difficult if you're a new player. But even as a veteran player, it's still the early game. The decisions you make in the early game have the most impact. That's not how any game should really work. Games should have a progressive difficulty. The more you play, the greater the challenge you encounter. That is just my perspective. This is an issue a lot of strategy games have, especially these kind of turn-based, strategy games, grand map strategy games. This is absolutely a significant problem. But I think it's something that Creative Assembly should tackle one way or another. My personal perspective would be kind of a progressive endgame crisis. Could be Chaos, could be Skaven, could be Dwarves, could be all of them, right? Let's say you're playing Chaos, then you get one option would be the Order-type factions get progressively better and better and better, spawning certain armies in a crisis, especially if you're invading the Empire. Just some ideas that I'm throwing out there, though I'm not especially fond of free AI armies, because a lot of the endgame crisis armies are not especially great, really. Like, they're armies led by random characters. Sure, we might get a legendary lord or a couple thrown in there with certain factions eventually, but again, it's just not really a great system. The way Creative Assembly handled it, it's been a problem for a while, and sadly enough, it's actually based on the quote-unquote endgame crisis of Total War Attila. Yeah, Attila's legacy is still felt to this day. I do believe this is one of the focus that Creative Assembly should have. If not for Warhammer 3, then for a future Total War game, this is absolutely something they need to address. And it can't just be like, oh, we're just going to spawn a dozen of high-end enemy armies and that's going to be our endgame. That is not fun. That's never been fun in any game, right? Especially in a game like Total War. That's my perspective on that subject. Next up, we have everyone's favorite topic, sieges in the game. Yeah, sieges in Total War have not really been great across many different games, but they're especially not great in Warhammer 3. The reason is, that a lot of the battle interactions and the dynamic gameplay that you can have in a lot of regular battles does get killed. I remember when Mandalore Gaming made a video on the subject of sieges in Warhammer 2 and like how all those fun battles got killed at the gates. Well, that's still unfortunately the case in Warhammer 3. Now, the reason behind this is, one, the defender gets a significant leadership benefit, which means that even if you severely end up outmatching them, they will still present an issue for you in that they will not break easily. So you need to kill a lot of them. Then there's the decision making of the AI. They won't defend the walls, but they won't abandon them either. So sieges end up being this kind of situation where you're just like, okay, how much can I push into exploiting the AI so that I can minimize my casualties? Of course, that is perhaps another issue to talk about, like how a lot of our decisions in Total War are designed around like minimizing casualties as opposed to having fun gameplay. Absolutely, right? That is absolutely an issue. But it is hilarious to think like Creative Assembly thought like, oh, we'll just improve the HP of walls and that will improve things. Or they literally tried to consider like, oh, we'll remove ladders from units and that will help fix sieges. No. Like, there are people who believe that, but those kind of people, like, it's issues like pathfinding that are the problem. It's like issues of the AI. It's issues of barricades in a settlement. And it's the incentive structure that gets created around those barricades. Because obviously, again, you want to minimize your losses as much as possible. So instead of like sending your army inside the wall, like you'll just win battles like this with a couple of ranged units just advancing block by block, taking minimal casualties. And if you run out of ammo, well, okay, we ran out of ammo. I'll just withdraw and do more damage if I can, assuming I don't lose my units because, you know, because of the assuming I have nothing to lose. And most of the time, you won't have much to lose. So you look at a battle like this, right? Like, outside of some of these guys taking damage, friendly fire damage even, outside of a couple of these guys taking some friendly fire damage, literally the entire enemy army has done absolutely nothing against me. Now, this is supposed to be an easy battle, but this battle has nothing. Like, it teaches you nothing. In fact, if it's teaching you anything, it's absolutely the worst kind of lessons. Someone who's getting used to playing these kind of battles in a campaign will not handle a proper battle in a campaign. And they do happen occasionally. I imagine that's one of the reasons why Legend of Total War actually ends up getting so many disaster battles. A player base that gets used to, you know, fighting battles like this, and then it's like, oh, shit, I have an enemy where this shit kind of doesn't work. What am I gonna do? Yeah. So this kind of gameplay is not great. All that, like, they spend so much time designing these kind of settlement layouts. They spend so much time trying to make these unique maps. And then they ruin them with this kind of choke point system of barricades and towers. Like, I understand barricades. Like, I think, but I think they're a problem. Like, the pathfinding is questionable enough in this game, even at the best of times, and then you ruin that even with more barricades. Like, the problem with sieges are not the towers. It's actually all the barricades and effects and all that. Though the towers also incentivize you as a player to engage with fighting in the settlement less, because obviously, again, you don't want to take more damage over there, right? So, not a great system. Making Sieges in Total War a tower defense game was one of the most questionable decisions I think Creative Assembly could have made, and one of the worst decisions Creative Assembly could have made. Will they ever rework Sieges? Well, I admit I'm very skeptical on that subject. Like, I really am, because they did spend a lot of time, effort, and energy in reworking Sieges already when Warhammer 3 is released, and that just says a lot about Realms of Chaos, doesn't it? But still, like, it's not great. It's never been great, and I think that CA does need to tackle this. There's actually, like, Shogun 2 and even Free Kingdoms can have better sieges in some ways, but don't get me wrong, those games have plenty of issues. But if I'm approaching a settlement in Shogun 2, you know, think about Shogun 2 for a moment. You have towers in that game, but they're easily destroyed, but they do offer a decent advantage if you use them properly. You have open layouts of settlements, and you can scale walls, but that doesn't mean you just Zerg rush the enemy unless you have an overwhelming advantage. You actually need to use tactic, strategy, all that. Sure, you might argue, well, you can just demolish the enemy with artillery from range. Yeah, that works until you run out of artillery ammo. There is a limit. Like, you can do a lot of damage with artillery, but there is a limit, and then you're stuck with an army that can attack a settlement, but they'll lose a lot of guys doing so. And again, and what I think is great about Shogun 2, especially, is that when you're approaching a settlement, if you have artillery or don't have artillery, you have to think about actual strategy, because you're not just going to be able to kill people on the walls. Like, you will lose the shooting match with units on the walls, right? You'll take more damage if you try and approach sieges in Shogun 2 in the same way as Warhammer 3. Those strategies will not work. So you have to be careful. You have to use strategy. You have to bait the enemy into going to defend a section of the wall, and then so you can sneak your guys inside. And when I say sneaking, I'm not talking about like just using stock and just getting guys on the victory point and winning. Just some ideas over there, but regardless of how they decide to fix this, sieges are not great in this game.